1000. Dave Chawner is a comedian, a presenter, and author of Weight Expectations, a book which outlines his struggle with his body image. How are you, Dave?
I'm very well, thank you, mate. How are you?
Fine, thank you. You and I are sort of peas in a pod, actually, when it comes to this sort of story, because your story is so similar to mine. It's slightly uncanny. Well, same outlook, different illnesses. But firstly, explain your story and how you got to write the book Weight Expectations.
So it's a book all about anorexia, but I didn't want it to be a sob story because I think it's a very difficult topic, and I wanted to engage blokes with that. And I think humour is a great way of doing it. So originally, because it was about anorexia, I wanted to call it The Real Hunger Games, but apparently that infringes copyright, and it
Oh,
sort of uses. Did you like that one?
I
It
did.
was
I did like that one.
basically, I think a lot of people have eating disorders or maybe even disordered eating. And I think lockdown has really brought that to the front. And I think perhaps one of the lesser talked about areas are blokes that struggle with food, eating, and that relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who listens to this program or has read any of my articles will know that in my struggles, I've gained and lost 100 stone in my lifetime, and I've suffered myself with really serious eating disorders for many, many years until I luckily was in a financial position to get it sorted out, because it certainly wasn't anything that the NHS were prepared to sort of stump up to help with. And I think that's a real issue for men as well, isn't it? That perhaps this is seen as sort of a women's problem, and that when a man goes and discusses this with their doctor, not every doctor, but in many occasions, they're sort of told to go home and get over it, essentially.
I think that is, it only takes one bad apple to spoil the barrel. And actually, GPs are getting so much better. And we really want to help GPs be better and be equipped because they don't have enough time to see people. But I think part of that awareness raising is to make people realize that it doesn't really matter what gender you are or what tackle that you have between your legs. You can still struggle with food, and that doesn't have to be, sort of dramatic. That can be just as difficult as, sort of having your exercise restricted and being constantly surrounded by food. We've seen that, sort of eating disorders have shot up by over 100% during lockdown, and that's terrible, but that's why we want to do something about it.
Absolutely. So, to what extent would you say? Well, where did your eating disorder come from? Would you say, Dave? Where did it start? How did it all come?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I think that's the $1 million question. I think for me, it was a number of different things. Of like, I was a teenager, and actually, one of the things that it did sort of try and suppress was that's when like, a lot of my friends became sexually active. And look, there's no need, no one needs to know about my sort of more intimate life, but I never really liked being a sexualized man because there were lots of mixed messages around. And actually, when you starve your body, you also starve your brain, and it can actually be a coping mechanism to literally starve out emotions that you don't want to have. And one of those was testosterone and manliness, but also as well kind of like dealing with exams, which I know a lot of teenagers are really struggling with at the moment. It was something that became a control.
And was it the fact that you were worried about how you looked in the context of you being a sexual being, or was it just a general anxiety about being a sexual being which manifested itself in the control you found by
It's a really
limiting
good
what you
question.
ate?
Yeah, this sounds like a really snowflakey thing to sort of say, but I always worried that I heard so many stories about blokes being sexual predators, about men only wanting one thing, and that kind of, I never wanted to be that sort of bad guy that was obsessed with boobs or with sex and only had a one track mind. And actually, when you starve your brain, it stops releasing a lot of the testosterone. So I became sort of very, very camp and very feminized. And I quite enjoyed that because it meant that I was seen as less of a threat to women. And I realize this all might sound a little bit wet to people. But I'm anecdotally speaking to a lot of blokes that, you know, kind of worry that they are now sort of sexual predators because they don't want to come across like
How
that.
old are you, Dave?
31.
31. Because I'm just trying to work out sort of eras. So that's a really interesting reason though, because it wasn't. So it was sort of external ideas and pressures on whether you would be inappropriate with women was making you want to sort of rob your desire of women. So it wasn't actually about what you physically looked like. It was about trying to, I guess, starve away your desires.
Well, the weird thing about the anorexia is a lot of stuff is talked about body positivity and body image, but actually for me, I actually didn't want to look good because I was never given like the emotional communication tools to explain what was going on in the old brain bun. So what I mean by that is if I had a problem, say with my stomach, I'd be able to go to the doctors and say, I've got this pain, it's sharp, it's throbbing, it's localized. Whereas if I've got a pain in my brain, I never had any of those words to explain it. So I quite literally used my body to show that there was something wrong with my brain that I couldn't put into words. And in terms of the kind of sexual stuff, yeah, I really wanted to starve out that all of those feelings, those emotions, those kind of throbbing hormones that were coming to me that I felt guilty about having.
I mean, this is like, I find this absolutely fascinating. I really do. Because had you said to me, um, when I was in my adolescence and I started becoming a sexual being, and I worried so much about what I would look like with my clothes off, that I felt the only option was to sort of physically change my appearance, and it went too far. I think to a lot of people that would be so much easier to compute, and I realise these things are not very easy to compute, but that would have been so much easier to compute than actually you're, I guess, building yourself up into a state of anxiety, so much so regarding whether you would be seen as predatory or inappropriate, making your fear of women essentially completely dominate what you did next.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a naysayer and say that you can't say anything nowadays or have a go at the Me Too movement. That's absolutely not what I'm about. What I am about though is anecdotally I've spoken to a lot of blokes who feel very much the same, that they want to be an ally, they want to be a good person, but there is so many negative headlines, so many negative stories about men overstepping the mark that they do, and I'm not discounting that
No,
at
but I
all.
wonder whether it's a reasonable assumption to say that with all this talk of men being these terrible predators, some men, we should say, not all,
Yeah.
I do think that what your story demonstrates is a real, I sometimes feel as a gay man, I'm a bit luckier in some ways these days because I know where I am. I know where I am with my relationship with women. I know where I am with my relationship with other men, with straight men, with gay men. I know who I am, where I am. Whereas I think the young heterosexual male today, I think would find it far more difficult. Not in everything. I don't think they perhaps encounter a lot of prejudice in the way a gay man might. But what I think that they're getting so many, being torn in so many different directions about who they should be, how they should be, what they should be. And I also think some of that does come from women. For instance, every woman I know wants a lovely man who'll scoop them up and take care of them. But then every woman I know doesn't go for any man that they know like that, because they all want someone who's actually completely vile, completely sexually predatory, and completely awful. And so you sort of get that mixed message. You get media telling you that you're going to be some sort of terrible predator. And actually, the kind of guys that are predators probably ignore that. It's the sensitive, nice guys that probably take that on disproportionately. You're told that there's an assumption that you're all sexist immediately and that you've all got an amazing amount of privilege purely because of what you've got between your legs, which some may, but some may not. So I have absolute sympathy for the young straight male of today just not knowing, feeling like they must be on some sort of tightrope as to what and who they should be.
And I get that, and I all also, I don't want to say, you know what, the real minority now is the straight white man. I'm not going like there, but I do think that it's brilliant and it's encouraging and it's amazing that we are having these conversations. Because you know what, Cristo, I don't think we'd have had this 10, 15 years ago. And I absolutely greet that with open arms. Instead of people being in their own little boxes, having open dialogues of being like, this is what it's like for me. Does that make you uncomfortable? Is this a problem? And how can we work together rather than working apart?
Well, I think it's a really good point that you make about that, and make about whether, I mean, it is unfortunately the straight, well, the working class white male. I don't know about the sexual orientation, but the working class male, white male, is the most disadvantaged in the education system now, for instance, because obviously there's been a lot of focus over the years of making sure, rightfully, that minorities that have perhaps faced prejudice in the past are no longer facing such a thing. But it kind of all becomes meaningless if there is one minority, majority, one group left behind. And that does seem to be the more acceptable sort of face of prejudice. I mean, it doesn't all actually relate as well just to sexism as well. It sort of relates to race. It relates to all sorts of different areas where it seems to be acceptable to berate the majority in a way that you would never do to a minority.
And it takes people like Martin Clunes to just make that little switch and go, yeah, you know what? Like, if we were actually sort of body shaming women like this, that wouldn't be cool. So can we just have a little bit of thought about that?
I was absolutely, and I think they still are actually. Um, I would imagine that it would have been today on Loose Women. I didn't see the show, but I would imagine it would have been a conversation that they were having about body shaming, and then they would have asked him about that, and that's where the question came from. Because I know when I was producing that program, we were absolutely passionate and militant about making sure that it would pass both tests. We wouldn't have, I think previously that show had been accused of sort of just four women slagging off men. And I know when I was there, the entire team were passionate about making sure that we would not have a conversation about men that we would not be prepared to have about women on the show. Because you're right, that sort of acceptable sexism towards men and these sort of cliches, oh, my man never sort of tidies up, and oh, he never does anything at home, and oh, he's useless in the bedroom. All of that is actually as damaging as having a go and making lazy stereotypes about women, which of course is not acceptable.
I couldn't agree more. It's all of this toxic masculinity which gets talked about a lot, but it's actually as well, it's damaging on so many levels, and it's not just for men. I think it's for society at large, because the amount of conversations that I've had with people that you wouldn't think of
Oh,
construction sites that really do worry about this kind of toxic masculinity and this. Oh, sorry, did I cut out?
yeah, you
There?
cut out, but it's
Oh.
fine. But you were talking about construction sites. You're saying that lots of construction sites worry about toxic masculinity. Do you mean?
Yeah, a lot of blokes. I speak to. I have a very good mates in construction. They were all sort of saying that they really worry about that. Sort of about their body image and about being body shamed. About people are now starting to have that conversation that we definitely wouldn't have had decades ago. So I absolutely applaud Martin Clunes for calling it out, because that's what it takes. It takes people to call it out and readjust the balance.
I also think that the man himself has changed dramatically. I mean, luckily I didn't need social media to have body dysmorphia when I was growing up. I did really well on my own. But I again imagine a younger person watching any reality show now who is a man. I mean, it used to be that women just have to worry about their weight, but now men as well, young men, worrying about their place in the world, worrying about what on earth direction they're supposed to take, worrying about whether they're too masculine, not masculine enough, sensitive but not so sensitive that girls won't fancy them. All of these different things going on in their head, and then you're presented with Love Island or Instagram, and literally the kinds of bodies that firstly are genetic for most of them, or secondly would entail sort of 8 hours in the gym, and they're probably demonstrating some other kind of mental body dysmorphic disorder themselves. Yet you've still got this barrage of images to contend with.
I think you're absolutely right to hit on that point, because it's so easy to blame social media. And we know for things like eating disorders and body dysmorphia, we know that Byron very famously had anorexia and was absolutely repulsed by his own body image. Very openly, he chronicled that, and there are numerous blokes throughout history that have had that. And I always say that, you know, actually blaming social media for negative body image is like blaming Damien Rice for depression. You know, it hasn't been created by them, but it don't help. And I think that's why I really do.
Oh, I disagree
Well,
with you on that. I really disagree with you on that. I really do. I think that what all it does is demonstrate what those men are not. And don't you think that having that barrage on a daily basis of what you don't look like on social media, if you're a young man thinking about your place in the world and about girls and how they're going to fancy you, do you not think that that's going to fuel the toxicity of your own opinion of yourself?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. It fuels it, it didn't create it. And I think the underlying concerns are already there of not feeling good enough, but it fans those flames and those embers that, you know, actually haven't been created by different social media platforms, but they are hugely exacerbated by them, if that makes sense.
And how are you now?
Thank you. It's a good question. I'd like to think that I'm good, and I'm very, very lucky that I have a really good support network of people that I can talk about with, and actually that talk about it to me, because that normalizes the conversation. But I'm not going to lie. Yeah, lockdown was tough, and I've got a few unhelpful comments about, you know, sort of my body image, my weight. I put on a couple of pounds, but you know what? Like, the thing that's really important now is the weight is like money. It will go up, it will go down, and there are going to be good and bad body days. But you know what? Actually talking about that, having an open conversation about that is really cathartic, because it's incredible when people come forward and say, you know what, I feel exactly the same. And that normalizes what would be something that's quite isolating generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you have to remember, which I'm sure you know, but it was the thing I really learned through therapy, is just how sly, devious, seductive your eating disorder is, and how the myriad of different ways it will sell itself to you as something that isn't an eating disorder. And that's something I found that I've still found myself, not anymore, but for many years, sort of, oh, I'm over my eating disorder, but I'm just going to try this crash shake diet. Or I'm over my eating disorder, I'm just going to limit my calories to 750 a day, you know, because that's normal, because that's what normal people do, you know. And even now, when I see an advert on telly for a new diet, and and you know, and it takes a moment where I have to go, oh no, that's an eating disorder, that's not a new diet, because it will be sly, it will convince you that you're cured.
And one of the most sly things, and I think that's such a great point, is when people say, and I always try and challenge this, when people say, I'm having a fat day. And I'll always ask, what do you mean by a fat day? And generally people will say, I feel quite sluggish. I feel like I'm a failure. I feel like a fraud. And I'm like, well, none of those things are actually to do with weight. What you're actually saying is you're having quite a negative health day.
And you know what I've just written down? What that is? That's a guilt day. That's
yes,
guilt. And you know what, Dave? Do you know what? I don't even need to ask whether you know what. You know probably better than I. That the guilt over a muffin I might have eaten after starving myself, or the guilt of a chocolate brownie that I would have, or the guilt of getting on those scales and being a pound heavier, or the guilt of knowing that I've had that pizza and that I need to start Monday my diet. That guilt would lead to a 4 or 5 stone weight gain, because immediately then I would make myself feel better by having a muffin, then I'd feel guilty about that, then I would binge and make a resolution I'd start Monday, and before I knew it I'd have gained 4 or 5 stone genuinely. And you end up in a cycle of sort of weight gain and guilt, and with me it was an eating disorder as well, so sort of bulimia and all these sorts of things, and before I knew it I'd have gained 5 stone back, and then the whole cycle starts again to get it back off. Guilt.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you know what you learn from those little slip-ups of, yeah, you know, there are days where, you know what, I literally just went out with a mate, and he had a burger and he had some fries left over, and I'd already had dinner, but I kept on picking at the fries, and I feel guilty about having that, and I feel very aware of my stomach.
It really doesn't matter. Do you know, Dave, I now eat more rubbish than I've probably ever eaten, but in a way that is normal. And I've never in my life, so I wasn't expected to sort of talk about the eating disorder so much tonight. I thought we were talking about dad bodies and stuff. So it's interesting, and I'm really enjoying it, just so you know. But I, for the first time in my life, I can have food in my house, and that's because I know I can have what I like now. And it's taken away the seduction of it all. So I have brownies in my freezer, and I have one. Sometimes I have two on every day. I have sweets if I want every day, and that's because I now know there are no rules, and I now know I've got nothing to feel guilty about. And weirdly, it's taken all the fun out of it. I don't want to stuff my face full of all of it anymore, and that's because of guilt. That's because the guilt has gone, and once you get rid of the guilt, you actually don't feel the need to control. And once you get rid of the control, you don't feel that you've got an eating disorder anymore.
And it's going to be, it always fascinates me how people say that they have a very healthy relationship with food. And then you start talking, and then they will say things like, "Oh, I can't buy crisps because I know I'll eat the whole pack," and then I'll feel guilty. And it is amazing how not everyone perhaps has an eating disorder, but a lot of people have
Yeah,
disordered eating.
disordered eating is absolutely, without a doubt, what a lot of people have, and a lot of people don't know that they have, as you just alluded to, eating disorders as well, or have such control over their food. And I now realise it was that control that was controlling me. I wasn't controlling it, and it was the thing that was keeping me fat, not getting me thin. So all the ways in which I thought it was my friend, it was actually my enemy. And it's sort of coming to that resolution, that revelation, whatever it might be, at this age. And I'm so glad you have as well, frankly. But also, I'm so glad that you are as aware as I am, and you're sort of as vigilant, because it will come back and try and bite you on the bum. Really good to talk to you, Dave, and I'm really glad you've written about it and that you're in a far better place with it all. That's Dave Chawner, Talk Radio favourite and author of Weight Expectations.